Okay, this is our second mini video lecture on the nervous system. This lecture is going to focus primarily on cells. So different types of cells found in our nervous tissue. Cells of our nervous system can be divided into two broad categories. One are the neurons. Neurons are the cells that are producing nerve impulses, so electrical currents that transmit throughout the body. These nerve impulses are also known as action potentials, and we're going to be talking a lot about action potentials in class. So since these are the cells that are sending the nerve impulses, they're often referred to as the functional unit of our nervous system. So these are the cells transmitting information. So when you touch a hot stove, it's the neurons that are sending that information to your brain so you know that stove is hot. When you're moving your arms, your legs, controlling skeletal muscle, those are neurons controlling the skeletal muscle. So they're known as the functional unit. They're relatively large cells. So here we see one neuron with its cell body and some processes sticking off the cell body like the large axon and some smaller dendrites. We're going to be talking more about neurons, their structure and their function in the next video. But this video is going to focus more on all the other cells found in your nervous system, and they're collectively known as neuroglial cells. Glial actually means glue. You can think of them as holding everything together. But they have very important functions. They're supportive, they protect, and they provide nutrients to the nervous tissue. So basically these neuroglial cells do all the dirty work. They don't get much of the fanfare. They're not considered the functional unit, but without neuroglial cells, our neurons would not function properly. And in fact, at a certain point in our development, we no longer make new neurons. So we need to protect these neurons. And that's the job of our neuroglial cells. So we're going to be looking at a number of different types of neuroglial cells. One thing, they're small. So this yellow arrow looks like it's pointing to nothing there, but there are tiny little cells surrounding this large neuron, protecting it, nurturing it. But they're a lot more abundant than the neurons. So there's many more neuroglial cells than there are neurons in the body. In fact, I believe your textbook suggests there's about 50 times more of the neuroglial cells than neurons. So they don't produce action potentials. They're not electrically excitable. They're not sending nerve impulses. But they're doing a lot of other things. One characteristic is that they can divide. So they divide by a process known as mitosis, which we've learned about in basic bio. This is different than neurons. So neurons do not divide. So right now, the neurons you have are not going to divide into more neurons. And any cell that cannot divide cannot become a tumor. So neurons cannot become tumors. And in fact, when we hear about brain tumors and spinal cord tumors, those are tumors of glial cells, neuroglial cells, not neurons. So those tumors are often referred to as gliomas because they're tumors of glial cells. We're going to cover 6 different types of neuroglial cells, whereas neurons are neurons and there's different types of neurons. We're going to look primarily in this lecture at the neuroglial cells. So what are they? Well, 4 of them are found primarily in your CNS, which is brain and spinal cord. So those are the astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, microglia, and epidermal cells. So those are only found in the CNS. The other 2 are only found in the PNS, peripheral nervous system. So outside the brain and spinal cord. These are Schwann cells and satellite cells. So we're going to go over each of these 6 neuroglial cells, talk a little bit about what they might look like, talk a little bit about why they're called what they are, and then most importantly, learn their function. So what do they do for our nervous system? So this drawing we're going to use quite a bit. So this is a nice colorful drawing. It's right out of your textbook, figure 12.6. It's nice and colorful. These colors are to help you identify the different types, right? So these cells are not actually this color, but this just helps us find them on this drawing. So this would be as if we took a chunk out of your nervous tissue, specifically your central nervous system, and we're looking at the different types of cells. So the first one are the astrocytes. So let's see why they would be called astrocytes. Well, astro means star, cyte means cell, so they're kind of star-shaped cells. And they're star-shaped because they have these processes that stick off of them. So here is what we call a protoplasmic astrocyte. We're not going to really discuss the difference between protoplasmic and fibrous, but kind of looks like a star. It's got these processes sticking off of it, which give it almost a star-shaped appearance. And we're going to learn what these processes do. So many processes, quote-unquote, star-shaped. They're only found in the CNS, so brain and spinal cord. Their function. Now, they have many functions, and if you read your textbook, they're going to talk about a lot of different functions, and we're still finding out new functions of astrocytes, and the list is pretty long. But on the short list of major functions is they form what's called the blood-brain barrier. So the blood-brain barrier is, as the name suggests, it's a barrier between your nervous tissue, your brain tissue, and the blood. So what this does, the blood-brain barrier kind of restricts certain substances from entering your brain. So it prevents certain things, certain chemicals from entering your brain, allows other things to enter your brain, but prevents a lot of substances from getting out of your blood vessel into your tissue. And you can see these cells. Let's look at this process here. It's kind of covering this blood vessel. So here's a blood vessel. So there might be things in that blood vessel we don't want entering our brain. So these astrocytes have what's called perivascular feet. Perivascular, so surrounding blood vessels. And they almost act like a covering to the blood vessel, preventing certain things from entering your brain tissue. Now, this is good and bad. It's good because it actually helps prevent infection quite a bit. So organisms are prevented from entering your brain tissue. What's hard for drug designers is to get certain medications into brain tissue. We always have to study if we want to deliver a drug to the brain, say to treat a certain brain pathology, we have to see whether it can cross the blood-brain barrier. Not all things can get into your brain tissue. So it only allows certain substances to enter your nervous tissue and restricts other things from entering your nervous tissue. So those are the astrocytes. Let's next look at microglial cells. So microglial are small cells. So we see that there's a green one here. Looks like there's another one down here. Now notice their relative size is small compared to some of the other glial cells. What they do is they act as phagocytes. So a phagocyte is a cell that can gobble stuff up. It can gobble up debris, cellular debris. So let's say there's a damage to this tissue. These microglial cells will kind of clean up that dead tissue, that necrotic tissue that might have been damaged. They also act as kind of immune cells, so protecting our tissue, our brain tissue, from microbes. So if a microbe gets in here, this cell will go over and gobble those bacteria or viruses up. Another important role is these cells can help repair damaged nerves. So if someone has a concussion or brain injury, microglial cells can help clean up and repair that damaged nervous tissue. So that's a very important role for these cells. Next one are the oligodendrocytes. So oligo means few, dendro means tree, So these are cells that have a few processes, and they kind of look like trees. Again, I didn't name them, but that's what it came from. These oligodendrocytes therefore have fewer processes than some of the other glial cells. They're only found in the CNS. Their major job is to form what's called myelin sheaths. Now we're going to be talking a lot about myelin sheaths. It's a very important substance that covers our neurons. So here's an oligodendrocyte. We see that it has fewer processes. So just in this one, I see there's a process sticking off of it here. There's one sticking off of it there. There's one sticking off of it there. Notice where these processes go. They go and cover the axon of a neuron. So these are neurons here. And this is their long axon. And these oligodendrocytes cover those axons. And what they do is they produce a substance. This substance has a lot of lipid, and fat in it, and protein, and it acts as kind of an insulator to the axon. So if you think of a neuron as being kind of like a wire, an electrical wire. Electrical wires are covered with that plastic covering, and that protects the wire. It helps allow the electrical current to move faster. So that's what myelin sheaths do. It's a fatty material that covers the axons of a neuron and helps that neuron send its action potentials or its nerve impulses faster. So myelin increases the speed of nerve impulses. Now we're going to talk about myelin in your PNS as well, but the myelin sheaths found in your peripheral nervous system are formed by a different type of cell. Oligodendrocytes form the myelin in our central nervous system. So I have on here analogous to Schwann cells. So Schwann cells are what produces myelin in the peripheral nervous system, whereas oligodendrocytes produce it in our central nervous system. Next cell, also only found in our CNS, are known as epidermal cells. Epidermal cells are a specialized epithelial tissue. So if you remember, one of the characteristics of epithelial tissue is it forms membranes or sheets. And the epidermal cells form kind of a covering or lining to what's called our ventricles. Our ventricles are cavities, cerebral cavities inside of our brain. So if we were to section open a brain, there are large fluid-filled cavities inside of our brain. And those fluid-filled cavities are lined with epidermal cells. We find them down the spinal cord as well, in a canal called the central canal of the spinal cord. Now these epidermal cells form these membranes, but these membranes produce a fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid we're going to discuss probably in more detail when we get to the brain. But what these epidermal cells do is produce this cerebrospinal fluid, and it actually gets produced from blood. It's kind of a liquidy fluid from our blood, and then it flows. So these epidermal cells kind of push this fluid through a certain path within our brain and down our spinal cord. And if you notice, these epidermal cells way down here, in order to push this fluid, they have little cilia that kind of push the fluid along so the fluid can move down its specific path. So epidermal cells are very important in producing cerebrospinal fluid, and we'll learn more about cerebrospinal fluid, but what it does is it nourishes the brain, it protects the brain, as well as your spinal cord. Okay, the next two neuroglial cells are only found in your peripheral nervous system. So these cells aren't found in your brain, they're not found in your spinal cord, they're found in peripheral nerves. The first ones are known as satellite cells. So satellite cells are called satellite cells because they surround the cell body of neurons. So what we're looking at here is a neuron buried under here. So neuron. And the neuron's cell body. The cell body of a neuron is where you're going to find the nucleus. So you can see a nucleus in there. And that cell body is surrounded and protected by many satellite cells. So just like satellites orbit the Earth, these satellite cells in essence orbit the cell body of a neuron. So these satellite cells are kind of flat cells that surround the cell body. They protect the cell body, and since there's a lot of them, they form kind of a swelling, and that swelling is known as a ganglia. So again, it's all about protecting these neurons. We have to protect neurons because they're the only neurons we have. So these satellite cells are going to help protect those neurons in our peripheral nervous system. Finally, the sixth neuroglial cell, the second found in our PNS, are known as Schwann cells. So Schwann cells, if you remember, are analogous to oligodendrocytes. Oligodendrocytes produce myelin in our CNS. Schwann cells produce myelin in our PNS. So myelin sheaths, again, the function of myelin sheaths are to insulate the axon and increase the speed of our nerve impulses. Some neurons are not myelinated. So we've got myelinated neurons, we have unmyelinated neurons, but it's always the myelinated neurons that send their nerve impulses a lot faster. So here we see two neurons. Panel A, we show what's called a myelinated axon. So here's the axon right down in the middle. So that's part of the neuron. Then we have some sheaths. So the sheath portion means there's layers. And if you look really closely, there's layers upon layers of this lipid, this fatty material that's going to surround that axon and really insulate it and allow that nerve impulse to travel very quickly. In fact, when we get to it, we're going to talk about that the action potentials actually hop along the axon. But if you see surrounding that myelin sheath is the Schwann cell. So there's the Schwann cell wrapped around the myelin, produces the myelin, wraps itself entirely around, all surrounding that axon of the neuron. Over here we have what's called an unmyelinated axon. So there are axons here. There's actually many axons. There's a Schwann cell there, but the Schwann cell isn't producing myelin. And there's reasons behind producing it and not producing it, but this just happens to be an unmyelinated axon, actually many of them. Still has a Schwann cell there, but the Schwann cell isn't producing myelin. Schwann cells are also very protective. They can actually help regenerate damaged neurons. So we can't replace and make new neurons, but we can definitely repair damaged neurons. And a lot of studies that are researching into how we can repair damaged spinal cords and get a person moving again that may not have been able to move since an automobile accident or something because of damage to their spinal cord. We're using Schwann cells to try to help repair those neurons in the spinal cord. So those are Schwann cells. So here we have myelin. We're going to end this video here and talk about myelination just again in the next video, where we're going to talk more about neurons.